What does loving your neighbor truly mean? Why should my church be involved in the city with those of other faiths? Why is it important for me to develop relationships with people that don't have the same faith as me or don't believe in the same things that I do? These are some of the questions that we're going to answer today here in our virtual roundtable series by GlocalNet. Our founder, Bob Roberts, along with Pastor Steve Bezner from Houston Northwest Church, are going to dive into these topics. If you've missed some of our other virtual roundtable series, please go back and check them out on glocal.net and follow us on our social media channels so we can continually bring you resources that are important and crucial topics to discuss. Thank you so much for watching this today. And here is Pastor Steve Bezner and Pastor Bob Roberts talking on multi-faith engagement.
Hi, I'm Bob Roberts, and I want to welcome you to this next virtual roundtable of GlocalNet. We are excited that you have joined us. These little roundtables have really grown, and we did not realize they would have the impact they have, but they do. GlocalNet is a very different organization. We talk about how that we're a family. There are three things that we require of our churches: that they plant churches around themselves, that they work in hard places of the world, and that they also engage their city. You cannot do those things and not connect with people of other faiths. Think about it. We start churches and we're growing them, and we see people accept Christ. When was the last time you heard of a church that was growing primarily because people of other faiths were finding Jesus? Why does that not happen? I think one of the keys is we don't know how to relate to one another in the public square. Acts did. I mean, there weren't any backslidden Baptists or Methodists or Catholics or Orthodox for evangelicals to pull on in order to see their churches grow. I think we've got to ask ourselves the question, what does it mean to relate to people in a migrated world? Migration today is like no other time in the history of humanity, but it creates an awesome opportunity. And we're excited to have one of the leaders of GlocalNet, Dr. Steve Bezner, with us today. Steve is an expert on Bonhoeffer. Steve has started a church. Steve has also pastored an established church, which gives him a lot of breadth in terms of what ministry looks like. And so, Steve, we are glad to have you today as we talk about multi-faith. And so thanks for joining us.
Bob, thanks a lot. I'm excited to be here. This is a topic that, as you know, is near and dear to my heart. So I'm very honored to be here. Thanks for having me.
Tell me a little bit about your church and ministry.
Absolutely. So I pastor Houston Northwest Church. We are a church that is located in the northwest part of Houston, Texas. It's a multi-ethnic church. We, in the last couple of years, have gone from being 98% Anglo to now we've crossed that marker that Mark DeMaz uses. So we now have more than 20% of minority ethnicities as part of our congregation. It's been exciting. Primarily a family-based church, but getting to do a lot of great work in that part of the city, just starting new churches and working and enjoying kind of the urban-suburban context.
So you're involved in church planting, global engagement. You work in your city big time. I mean, you've got a significant influential presence in Houston, and yet you do one of the most controversial things that you could. You become friends with Muslims. Why do you do that? What do you want to mess it up for, man?
Well, yeah, probably wasn't maybe the smoothest process, but I did that because Bob, just in conversation with you over the years, I really began to question some of my own presuppositions. And as I began to really read the New Testament, I started to notice that Jesus was always friends with and hanging out with the people that religious people thought were off limits. And I began to notice in my own life that I had created these invisible barriers, and I was unwilling to cross those barriers to be friends with people. And I was obviously cordial to everyone, but I wasn't being intentional in trying to create friendships with people that Jesus would have been friends with. So it was really just rediscovering the idea of the kingdom in the New Testament, trying to model Jesus. And I think in doing that, it challenged me, and it's been fun challenging our church to do that as well.
What's the difference between the word multi-faith and interfaith?
That's really good. In our context with GlocalNet, we use the word multi-faith. And we use that word because in the evangelical world, I think that the term interfaith got a bad rap because the understanding in the evangelical world with regard to interfaith was that interfaith meant that we essentially all believe the same thing. We just express it in different ways. And so you might read different theologians talking about we're all going to the top of the same mountain, but we're just taking different paths, getting to the top of that mountain. But multi-faith is actually something very, very different. Multi-faith does not attempt to synthesize each of those religions into one universal religion. Multi-faith basically says we believe different things and we're not trying to say that we believe the same thing. So when I sit down with my Muslim friends or with my Jewish friends, there is no pretense and no attempt to even act as if we believe the same things. Instead, we respect one another's differences, and in doing so, we think we're actually able to have more robust conversations. We're able to actually get to those theological dialogues that are typically avoided in many interfaith settings. I won't say all, but in many. And then I think it lets us have true friendship and actually work together in a way that's beyond many other service projects because we actually have a true knowledge of one another, a true friendship.
What do your relationships look like with Muslims and Jews and others there in Houston? How are you in relationship with people, and what do those relationships look like?
It's really good. If you have time, I'll just kind of tell the story of how I connected with the local mosque. Just watching you, seeing some of your interactions, I think really began to weigh on my heart. And if you remember the shooting in Paris at a nightclub that was perpetrated by a fundamental fundamentalist Islamic terrorist, I was driving to my office, church office one morning, and I drive right by a mosque every single day. And on my way, I just sensed the prompting of the Holy Spirit in my heart that said, you need to go in there and tell them that you love them. And so I did. I turned into the mosque. I went in, and they had just had an art festival. They were cleaning up, and there was a guy. I met him. His name was Muhammad. And I said, hey, Muhammad, my name's Steve. I'm a pastor. I really just want to get to know your imam. And he was rightfully, I would think, suspicious. He wondered why in the world would this white evangelical pastor be in here. But after I went through a couple of layers of security, I eventually had the opportunity to meet with the imam from the mosque. It's very near my church. And when we met for lunch. And I'd only been talking to him for about 5 minutes. And I don't know what I said, but I said something, and he looked at me and he said, hold on a second. Can I ask you a question? And I said, yeah, sure. He said, do you think I'm going to hell? And I said, wow, well, according to my tradition, yes, if you do not believe in Jesus, you will spend eternity apart from God in hell. And he looked at me. I'll never forget this. He said, good. I think you're going to hell too. We can have an honest conversation. Yeah. He said, these other Christians come in here and they act like we believe the same thing, and we don't believe the same thing. So I got his respect, oddly, not by pretending to agree with him, but by being honest with him. And that's one of the things that we talk about at GlocalNet on a regular basis, is about having one conversation, not trying to put on a face towards one group and then have a different conversation with my own religious denomination. So at any rate, with that conversation, my church began a relationship with the local mosque. We've had their elders and our elders get together for a dinner. We've interviewed the imam at my church. That's spread out through My Neighbor's Keeper, an organization that partners with GlocalNet. In the city of Houston, Rabbi Steve Gross has become a personal friend. He actually was going to be leading a Passover Seder at my church, but then COVID ended up eliminating that. That was a tragedy, but just a great, great friend there. And so with him, Imam Daniel Hernandez, who's down in Pearland, and then Imam Mamdu, who's up by my church. We've gotten together. We've had Seders together. We've had iftars together. So we've just created kind of this great relationship. And what's been funny now is that, we've had these folks into our house. and we have true, real conversations. So when COVID hit, I'm a pastor of a church, and so lots of pastors were texting me, "Hey, Steve, what is your church going to do? How are y'all going to handle this?" Well, I was getting texts from synagogues and from mosques in Houston. "Hey, how are y'all going to handle this situation? Are y'all going to do in-person worship? Are y'all going to wear masks?" All that kind of stuff. So I just think that it's interesting to see that the clergy life is common in many ways across religious barriers. And even though theologically I disagree with my Jewish and Muslim friends, we have a lot of common struggles about trying to create boundaries, about not carrying the weight of our congregation personally. And all of those things have been really interesting to realize, that common humanity is a bond, and that allows us to have great conversations.
Steve, why do you think it's so hard for evangelicals to relate to Muslims? I mean, for some strange reason, we like the Jews, we tolerate the Buddhists and the Hindus, don't care for the atheists, but man, it's like we despise the Muslims. Why do you think that is?
I think that religious evangelicals struggle because they see Muslims as zealous, and in the same way that evangelicals are passionate about evangelism and are passionate about growth, so are Muslims. They are passionate about evangelism to their own cause, to their own faith, and they want to grow. And I think that as the number of Muslims increases, evangelical Christians feel threatened by that. And so those two things, I think, really contribute to it. And then I think there's just a number of social things. I think that the role of women has been a very interesting discussion, and it's been a point of contention, I think, between evangelicals and Muslims, particularly not just culturally, but maybe even politically. One thinks about some of the conversations that the United States has had with Saudi Arabia and other kind of regimes and that sort of thing. So I think those are some of the things that create tension. And then I also think that evangelicals historically have a faith that is very isolated. It's very defensive minded. It's us against the world. And so I think that there's a tendency to look at any outside faith as evil. And again, I don't agree theologically with my Muslim neighbors, but having sat with lots and lots of Muslims at this point and had lots and lots of conversations, they are not any more evil than I am. And they're certainly not any more evil than any of my other neighbors. They want to raise their kids well. They want what's best for their family. They want to see a healthy community. Those things are things that I think that evangelicals haven't had to grapple with, because for the most part, they've lived that isolated kind of defensive mentality, and so they haven't engaged them. I don't know if that...
Has your perception of Muslims changed as you've been in relationships with them? And if so, how?
100%, absolutely. I think I was in that same mindset. And I would also say I was afraid of them, because I think that my perception of Islam was a religion that was dominated by violence, because that was what I had seen on television. And so whenever I began to have these conversations, one of my staff members, who he's now retired, but he has a little ranch out in Central Texas, and he found out that our local imam liked to go deer hunting. So he took him deer hunting, and he's sending me pictures of the imam and him in the morning having coffee. He's reading his Quran. My staff pastor's reading the Bible. Then they got him a deer, that day. He's just a guy. And he's trying, he's married, he has kids. He's trying to raise his family the way we are. Again, does he have a different picture of what the goal of society is in some respects? Yes. But we have a lot of common ground. And as I began to discover that, talking about food, talking about family, talking about job responsibilities, I began to realize these are just people like me. They're not, these diabolical villains that are plotting world domination any more than evangelicals are plotting world domination.
I'm curious about this, Steve. When you relate to them, a lot of people go, well, man, you're going to bring these people and you're going to normalize them to others. They're going to convert. They're going to confuse your people. You need to keep your distance. What do you say about that?
That's a great question, Bob. And I have had that very conversation. One of my friends, local pastor, said to me, Steve, all that the Muslim community is looking for is to be normalized so that they can be accepted, and your actions towards them is only contributing to that. To which I said, you may be right, but I haven't heard any better plans for loving my Muslim neighbors. And so right now, this is the best plan I've got. And that's what I'm gonna do. I'm gonna reach out to them. I'm gonna love them.
What impact has it had on your theology?
Oh man. Well, I think in some ways it's forced me to simplify things, particularly talking about Jesus. I was way too complicated in the way that I would talk about Jesus as divine. I think the Trinity is a doctrine that is confusing not just to Muslims but to Jews as well. I did a conversation with a rabbi on Zoom just a couple of weeks ago, and that was the first question. Can you explain the Trinity? And I think that Christians have made that the cornerstone of their faith, three persons in one, Father, Son, Spirit. They haven't found a way to simply articulate it that makes sense to outsiders, even really to many Christians. I also think too that it has forced me to recognize that much of what Jesus did was just love without abandon. He would just go out there and love freely, and he would have the conversations about faith as people were open to it and would receive it. And I realized that what I was doing is I was spending a lot of my time trying to create events that people would attend so that I could tell them about Jesus, instead of living out a faith that was by the way. Because my church members can't model a faith that requires them to organize events. But my church members could hop on Facebook and see, hey, Steve had lunch with 3 of his Muslim friends, and that kind of stuff. The other thing too that I've realized is that theological, or I should say rather, friendship allows me to actually have a true path to invite people to church. So like I've had the opportunity now to quote unquote speak in 2 mosques. I've had the opportunity to speak in a synagogue. Now, I don't think there's been any converts. Maybe there have been, and I just haven't known about them. But I got to share the gospel and explain who Jesus was, the cross, the resurrection, the impartation of the Holy Spirit in a synagogue and in 2 mosques in the city of Houston. I've now had the opportunity.
They let you do that?
Yeah, absolutely. Because they said, we want you to come and we want you to tell us what Christians believe because we know that you love us.
So you do share the gospel?
Absolutely.
It's not just, okay, I want to be nice to you so we don't kill one another. You talk about Jesus and what you believe.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that, so back to your original question, I mean, whenever we had the imam come to our church and I interviewed him, there were a lot of folks who, were nervous, but, none of my church members converted. They heard and they understood this is different. So like at the end of the conversation, one of my questions I asked was, can you know beyond a shadow of a doubt that you'll spend eternity with God after you die? And the imam said, I could never know that. Well, that was a clear moment for my church where they realized, oh, theologically, we're different. There was kind of an audible gasp because that's a very important doctrine in the evangelical community. And they said, wow, okay, that's different. So it helps us hear one another. We get to express difference. I think it's been really productive, and it lets my church members now have conversation with their Muslim neighbors, their Jewish neighbors, and they're not afraid.
What have you learned about God in all of this that you didn't know before this?
Great question, Bob. I think that I've learned really that God's love of people is so much bigger than I ever imagined. Because the multi-faith conversation really pushed me, not just in multi-faith, it pushed me in areas of race and in culture, because it forced me to see other perspectives. It pushed me politically. And so I had lived in this world my entire life where I valued, and I really only valued what I knew. And what I knew was white, evangelical, small town Texas, Republican culture. And now I realize that there are so many important perspectives that are present throughout the world and throughout the cultures. I live in Houston, which is now considered the most ethnically diverse city in the United States, if I don't have the ability to see the image of God in all of those races, in different political perspectives, in
Wow,
each of these cultures, I'm going to miss out.
that's good. What have you learned about yourself?
Yeah.
Pushing yourself to be friends and hang out with different kinds of people.
Well, I've learned that I used to be ruled by fear, and I've learned that it's such an incredible adventure to get to know people that are different, because that, I think that it moves me to be a new person, and it moves me now to a place where I've learned that it's exciting to step outside my boundaries. And so that's been really fun. We did a thing at our church back at Thanksgiving. We called it International Friendsgiving, and we invited the international community to the YMCA, and we fed them a traditional American Thanksgiving dinner. And they, they don't eat that. They have something totally different. And so then each of those communities, the mosque, some folks from Kenya, some folks, from different Asian countries, they came and they brought some of their own dishes from their country. So we had kind of this big potluck. And then I just got to stand up and say, hey, we want to help you be a neighbor. I know some of you are refugees, and if you need to navigate the refugee system in Houston, we want to help you. I know some of you are not Christians, but our church would be happy to help you with assistance in learning the language and in feeding you. And if you want to ask questions about faith, we'll be happy to provide a Bible for you. And I never would have thought about that idea, and our church never would have had that idea, I think, unless we had been accustomed to reaching out. And so the crazy thing was that wasn't even my idea. That was an idea of one of my team members, Chris. And Chris had that idea, I think, or Chris and Robin had that idea, I think, because they'd seen my heart. Let's reach out. Let's engage different people. So it's been fun.
What would you say to someone who they want to engage, a Muslim or Jew or some other religion? What's a simple first step they could do?
That's a great question. I mean, I know that it might depend on where you live, but if you live in an area where there is a mosque or a synagogue, I think the simplest way is just to go there and to just meet someone. If you live near a mosque, they do prayer multiple times a day, and they value hospitality. If you live near a synagogue, if you go to visit there during a time when there's an event or a prayer service or a worship service, I've not found people more excited to explain their faith than the Jewish community. So I think it's just a great opportunity. If you don't have those folks in your neighborhood, I think that it's pretty easy now because of the digital world to look for an individual online, try to connect with them. And then if you do live in a place like Houston, your kids probably have friends who are of a different faith, and you can get to know their parents.
What would you say to a church that wants to move into this? Where's the first steps?
That's good. I think the first step is you got to explain to your church why you're doing it. If I could do anything over again, I would probably go back and talk about that more with my church at the beginning, because my leadership style is sometimes let's go and we'll figure out all the problems, along the way. And in doing that, I confused some people, and I think I lost a few people. In fact, I know I lost some people. And instead of that, I think it would be better to explain, hey, we're going to begin preparing to do this. And if you have questions about this or concerns about this, let's have a conversation and explain to them, the heart of God for all people. And that this isn't about us changing our theology. This is about us loving and knowing our neighbor. And it's also about us looking for ways to serve our neighbor. And I think if I would have done that, it would have gone smoother. So I would say that would be the starting place. And then I would just, kind of the same thing. If you're a pastor and you're wanting to engage a synagogue or a mosque in your area, just go there and meet somebody and say, let's go get coffee. Let's go get lunch, and just ask a lot of questions and listen. Don't talk very much. Just listen, because they know a lot about you, most likely. I was shocked to discover how little I knew about Judaism and how little I knew about Islam and how much they knew about Christianity, because they are, in our context, a minority culture. And so they have to know what the majority faith is. They have to know what the majority culture is. So that was humbling, and I had to be willing to listen and to learn.
Tell us a little bit about the My Neighbor's Keeper retreat. If a pastor wanted to do that, or an imam or rabbi, how would they do it? And just a little bit about what it's like.
Absolutely. So we have done My Neighbor's Keeper retreats in cities across the United States. I was part of one here in Houston, Texas. And what we do is a lot of fun. We're basically together for 24 hours. We have a group of pastors, evangelical pastors, a group of rabbis, and a group of imams. And we get together and we talk about all kinds of stuff. I think one of the most painful and enlightening and fun exercises is when we get together as a group and we say, what do you think about this group? And what do you think about this group? And what do you think they think about you? So revealing. And you begin to see all of these biases that you have and that others know that you have. It's kind of embarrassing, but then you go and you sit down and you eat dinner together. We laughed a lot at our retreat. One of the evangelical pastors who was raised kind of in the country, his name's David, and David was talking about when he'd served his church 25 years, it presented him in the pulpit as a gift with a new shotgun. And I mean, the rabbis and the imams were just laughing like, your churches are crazy. Why would they do that? And so my pastor friend David asked one of them, are you telling me that you don't own a rifle? And one of the imams was sitting there, his big beard. He had his kind of garb on, his long flowing robe. And he said, do you think they're going to let me buy a rifle at Walmart looking like this? And I mean, everybody was just dying laughing. And we had a lot of fun talking about that. And we discovered, so that led into a conversation of why do evangelical pastors have guns? And it turned into, well, it's more of a culture thing about hunting and how we grew up. And then it turned to kind of a talk about peacekeeping and avoiding violence. So what do you think about violence? And should you use violence? And so kind of these long conversations around a campfire. So we left there friends. And I would say that if you have a desire to be part of something like that, you can just hop on the GlocalNet website, contact us. We would love, if you're a pastor, a rabbi, or an imam, and you want to be part of that, we'd love to hook you up with one of those My Neighbor's Keeper retreats. We're going to be doing more of those in the future, and they are fun.
Why are you a part of GlocalNet, Steve?
Well, Bob, it started, I originally was part of GlocalNet because of you. You cast a vision at a conference at Saddleback Church in 2008. I had never heard it before. You talked about the importance of church planting and the kingdom of God. I went to the book table. I bought all your books that you had out at that time. I stayed up all night reading. And so I came to GlocalNet because of you. And I want to be clear. I'm glad that you're there and I love you. But I have discovered along the way a family. And there are other pastors, other planters, church leaders who see the kingdom of God as the central aspect of what we're trying to do, to bring resurrection to the world, to partner with God in the redemption and the renewal of all things. And they have a heart for that. And I have been blessed to sit with them, to cry with them, to laugh with them, to travel with them. And, I would, no disrespect to other denominations or networks, but when you find your family and they will support you and you find those relationships, that is when things really begin to blossom.
Dr. Bezner, thank you for joining us today. I appreciate this. So
Thanks so much.
You heard him. If you want to find out more about GlocalNet, you can go to the website, glocal.net. You can email us, ask any question you want. We do a lot of things. We start churches, we engage nations, we work in the inner city, we do multi-faith stuff, we're involved in multi-ethnic stuff, you name it, because what Steve said is true. It's all about the kingdom. And kingdom is not a widget machine spitting out parts. It's a journey. It's a fast-moving river. We jump in and we hold on for dear life, traveling with Jesus. So we'd love to have you be a part of that. Thanks, Steve. Thanks for joining us today. See you next week, everybody.
Thanks, Bob.